Thanks for joining us on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. Russia very nearly tumbled into full-on civil war back over the weekend as the head of a Russian mercenary group that was closely affiliated with the Russian government turned against Vladimir Putin, of course, the head of the Russian government. The Wagner military group, led by longtime Vladimir Putin ally Yevgeny Prigozhin, took over southern Russian military headquarters in the city of Rostov on Saturday, and that military group, the Wagner military group, they marched towards Moscow with thousands of soldiers before turning back. While a truce was ultimately negotiated by the president of Belarus that saw Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner military group, gain amnesty in Belarus, it was clearly the biggest threat to Vladimir Putin's 23-year run atop the head of the Russian government. Joining us with a bit more about this dramatic turn of events in Russia is CU Denver Professor Christoph Stefes, who specializes in Russian and Eastern European studies. Christoph, first of all, thanks for joining us here again. What did you make of what happened over the weekend, and were you surprised or taken back by what we saw?
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me again. No, I wasn't really surprised. I mean, the feud that was going on between Prigozhin and Shoigu and Gerasimov, like the leaders of the defense and ministry, uh, that what had to come to a boil at some point, for sure. And then it came to a boil when Shoigu told essentially Prigozhin that Wagner had to register with the Russian army, and which meant the end of Wagner and his Prigozhin's command over the Wagner Group. So at some point, Wagner had to react to that, and I think he did. He had two things. I mean, two options. One is lay down the arms, or the other one making a threat to essentially Putin. And so he marched, and he had probably hoped that somehow the Russian military would side with him, or at least parts of it. The chicken game didn't pay off. So around 120 miles before Moscow, he said, okay, let's negotiate. He tried to reach Putin. Putin wouldn't pick up. And in the end, a deal was brokered, so it seems, by the Belarusian president. We don't really know, but I wasn't really surprised because, for a long time we have been waiting for this quite hollow regime to show cracks, and this is a first real big crack.
Does this mean, in your view, that Putin's hold on power, despite the fact that he won, quote unquote, he wins this, as you mentioned, Prigozhin turns away, he's now in Belarus, seemingly out of the picture, at least in Russia. But does that mean that Putin's hold on power in Russia could be shaky?
I think his win is he won a battle essentially, but he lost the war. Because now it's pretty much clear to everyone that his hold on power is pretty unstable. It's he can be easily blackmailed, because that's all what Prigozhin did. Essentially blackmailed Putin. He said, like, we're gonna continue marching on. I mean, it was maybe a hollow threat, but nevertheless, Putin initially said, okay, this guy is a traitor. We have to, we go after him, and then he strikes a deal. And he left Moscow, it seems. So he was so afraid that he wouldn't even get Yeltsin in 1991, right? During the coup, Yeltsin got on the tank and he was there. And Putin just is in his bunker and then even leaves the city. So he seems very vulnerable right now to everyone within Russia, the Russian elite. I mean, there were, private jets leaving Moscow on this weekend. People who didn't really believe that Putin would win this, and they just took off and went to neighboring countries. So to me, it's very obvious that many people have realized that Putin is quite vulnerable, and I think it's the beginning of the end of the Putin regime.
Fascinating indeed. For us here in America and for much of the West, obviously Putin has been seen as a tyrant, and I think somebody that a lot of people have in the West and in America specifically wanted to see get out of power. What does a shaken Putin look like, and how could that further disrupt or perhaps strengthen relations between America and the West and Russia?
Well, that's a complex question, right? Initially, you said, this looked like a civil war. I think it would have not turned into civil war. There is no popular movement right now against Putin. There are no opposition leaders who could, stage an alternative to Putin, like who could actually present something to the Russian people that could be a clear alternative to this man. That's the problem, right? So Putin, through his repression, this control of the media, has essentially eliminated any kinds of alternatives to his rule. But at the same time, that has not contributed to him being stronger, because as you have seen, as Prigozhin started to move towards Moscow, there was really no citizens that would oppose him. Like, I mean, in Rostov, he was like actually he was, almost cheered on, to come. So I think the people, the Russian people, are just very apathetic. So that makes it really, really problematic. And we don't really see that there could be an alternative to Putin presented. So what could it be? We could see like a internal conflict between various warlords, and the outcome of which could be even a disintegration of Russia. Right? So who knows where Chechnya goes? Kadyrov, what he decides to do, that's very unclear.
So very unstable, I think, safe to say at this point. One initial thought, correct me if I'm wrong here, because you'll obviously know way more about this. The initial thought I had when I heard about this and seeing what you've said so far, I kind of think back to the 2016 coup attempt against Erdogan in Turkey, the head president of Turkey, still is, and he pretty harshly put it down by jailing thousands of perceived dissidents, including journalists. Could Putin do the same here? And who would he arrest? Because to your point, it seems like there isn't a ton of dissent, at least publicly, in Russia at this point.
A very different situation, right? In 2016, Erdogan, Turkey, there were like masses of people who were opposing on the street this military that went against Erdogan, right? The people who tried the putsch, and here, nothing. We have seen of the Russian people to stand up against Prigozhin and the Wagner Group at all. So that's the first difference. And the second one is, Erdogan used this situation to jail thousands of civil society representatives and journalists. But Putin has already done that. Who else would he at this point have? He runs out of people he could arrest, he could repress. I don't even think, and this is also like with Wagner, Prigozhin. Prigozhin seems to be still under investigation, right? So the deal is not really clear. Prigozhin now is in Belarus in exile, but seems to be still under investigation. But I really don't see what else Putin could do at this point. I mean, he has arrested already. I mean, here Navalny is facing new charges. He's going to spend probably the rest of his life in jail unless, we find a totally different regime coming to power. But he has run out of options, really. That is why I think Putin's regime is nearing its end.
So I guess if that's the case, maybe in the shorter term window, the Ukrainians have begun their counteroffensive and turning our attention to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. How does this affect the Russia-Ukraine conflict, with the Wagner military group playing such a big role, especially in the earlier capture of Bakhmut earlier in the spring?
Well, it was a very costly victory. I think Wagner is pretty decimated. They wanted to recruit more of prisoners from jail. I don't think that makes a huge difference in terms of like the sheer numbers of troops. But what makes a difference is psychology. Like, how do Russian soldiers? They will definitely hear about this. How do they feel about some of their own, marching to Moscow? How they feel about Putin fleeing, at least Moscow, if not the country. I think they're already pretty demoralized, not knowing what they're doing there in Ukraine. This will make it or the worse. And another thing is, of course, if Putin is, stays Putin, then will he actually remove some of these military forces to protect him for the next mutiny? So this will definitely benefit Ukraine. I think all analysts pretty much say, and it already has, right? We know that Ukraine has now crossed an important river, is moving towards Bakhmut to recapture Bakhmut, is moving south pretty much. So Ukraine is benefiting a lot at this point.
I guess I know you kind of touched on this earlier. I guess my final main question to you here, Christoph, would be from a broad perspective. Let's say it goes in the way where the Ukrainians continue to gain momentum on the battlefield in eastern Ukraine. Putin continues to get weaker and weaker. What does Russia look like in a year?
I think it all depends a lot on Putin himself, right? Is he willing to negotiate? I mean, that's a little bit my prediction. I think the only way out for Putin at this point is to actually negotiate, start the negotiation for a peace settlement with Ukraine. So maybe he's able to win, not to win, to keep some of the territories that have been occupied since 2014. This is a new development. So now for the first time, Ukraine is recapturing territory that was already lost in 2014. This is huge. If they are moving closer to Crimea, which is the crown jewel of Putin's, war on Ukraine, then I'm sure that Putin at some point will have to negotiate, because he has to, because otherwise he's going to lose everything, and that means also losing all his political power, maybe even his life. You know how it goes in Russia. So I think this is good news for the war. I mean, for the Ukrainians, and that this war will end by the end of this year. That's my prediction.
Is this good news for the West as a whole?
Well, for the West, for sure, right? I mean, this has been costly. This war has been costly for the West as well, right? We are supplying Ukraine with all these weapons, with all this economic help and support, financial support. If this finally came to an end, I think everyone would gain.
Fascinating indeed. Well, I'll leave it there. I have probably a million more questions I could ask you, but Christoph Stefes from CU Denver, we appreciate the immense your time and lending us your expertise and the context on what we're seeing here in Russia and what was a dramatic turn of events over the weekend. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me again.